Hello, I'm Kevin, VK6 Lima Whiskey, and welcome to Amateur Radio Topics. In today's episode, I'm primarily going to talk about receive antennas. Now, these are particularly important on the low bands, 160, 80 and 40 metres. Mainly because there's a lot of noise on those bands, either man-made or atmospheric noise, that will obscure the DX you're trying to work. Now, there are various forms of receive antenna, and at first it might seem a little bit counterintuitive to have an antenna that maybe gives you a lower signal than you may get using your transmit antenna. But let's say, for example, you're using a vertical as your main transmit antenna. That's going to pick up an awful lot of noise, both local noise and atmospheric noise. And whilst it may be efficient as a transmit antenna, it's not really going to help digging out those weak signals that are close to the noise level. Hence the need for a receive antenna. Now, I've been using Beverages for some time. I've got some space here that I can put these Beverages up, and they work really quite well. They're fairly non-critical in terms of the format. They don't have to be running a dead straight line. You can take some liberties with the direction that it's pointing in, particularly in terms of using local support such as trees or part of the house. So it's not too hard to put a Beverage up, and ideally you need to try and get this antenna maybe around about 7 or 8 feet in the air, which is quite handy because it keeps it away from most of the things that would cause the wire to perhaps break. The wire I use is fairly thin gauge. It's probably around about a 22 or 24 gauge wire. It's not particularly thick, just copper wire, and it's fed at one end with a 4-to-1 type balun straight into just fairly cheap 75 ohm TV coax. And ideally you want this antenna to be around about one wavelength long at the design frequency. So let's just say hypothetically you want a Beverage for 160 metres. You're going to need an antenna that's around about 160 metres long, around about 600 feet, somewhere around that vicinity. Now, I realise that's not entirely possible for everybody to achieve this, but even a shorter Beverage can still work fairly well on 160, even something that's a half wavelength. So something more around the 260, 270 feet mark will work fine on 160. The far end of the Beverage can be terminated with around about a 600 ohm resistor down to earth, and it's not critical, but what this does is it does tend to give the Beverage a unidirectional pattern. So it fires in the direction away from the feed point if you terminate the far end with a resistor. A non-inductive resistor is really quite important. Now at the feed point, with the matching transformer, normally you need a ground rod, so you try and get that down as far as you can. But something like a 4 or 5 foot ground rod is quite adequate. And then from that ground rod, I've got 2 or 3 just 30 foot wires, and about 10 metre wires that act as radials or counterpoises at the ground point. And I've got the same arrangement at the far end, where the antenna is terminated with a resistor down to a ground rod, and again a couple of 10 metre 30 foot type counterpoises at that point. So this is a really simple setup. If you put a Beverage up for 160 metres and you get something that's around about 550 feet or 600 feet out in more or less a straight line, doesn't matter if it follows the undulations of the ground. If the ground's a bit up and down, it really doesn't matter too much. Doesn't matter too much if it's 6 foot above the ground, 8 foot above the ground, it's still going to work. And you'll also be able to successfully use that on 80 metres and also on 40 metres. And if you do the modelling, you can see the difference in the pattern as you go higher in frequency. Once you get past 40 metres, once you get to 30 metres and 20 metres, it's really not quite as effective. I've used my beverages to good effect on 30 metres. On 20 metres, they really start to lose effect. But there have been times in some contest type conditions where I've used the beverage on 20 metres just simply to try and listen down through the frequency a little bit if there's a big pile up or there's a lot of noise, the QRM's really heavy, and the beverage can sometimes help with this. So the big advantage the beverage has is that it offers a better signal to noise ratio. So yes, the signals are lower. Maybe on your vertical, the station you're trying to listen to is S7, but the noise is S9, and you're going to really struggle to pull that station in. On the beverage, the same station might be S4, S5 maybe, but there's very little noise. The noise level might be virtually non-existent, may not even register on the S meter. Quite often with a beverage, you do need to use the preamp on your transceiver. You can build a preamp and put it at the feed point, and that works quite well. But I'm finding with really these modern transceivers with 2 levels of preamp, it's more than enough for a beverage. Quite often on my long beverage on 80 and 40 meters, I'm just using the first level of preamp. I'm not even using preamp number 2. So, but the idea is to get a good signal to noise ratio. So the beverage definitely helps in this regard. If it's terminated at the far end, it becomes unidirectional, which is quite useful. If you run 2 beverages at right angles to each other, you've got 2 directions. I've got one beverage facing to the US. I've got another beverage facing to Europe. And when I switch between the 2, the difference is quite remarkable on the low bands. Stations that I can hear quite clearly sound the US beverage. If I flick over to the European beverage, I can't hear them at all. So it's pretty amazing to get that difference. If you want to make the antenna bidirectional, you simply remove the terminating resistor at the far end. You leave the beverage unterminated, and then it will give you a bidirectional pattern. Now, there are some reasons for doing this. If you're living in an area where there's maybe not too much noise around, you don't need to null out the noise from one direction or the other, then the bidirectional pattern can be really useful. And I have experimented with this here, and I'm in a fairly quiet rural location. So the bidirectional pattern actually works quite well for me. It means that on the US beverage, I can fire either to the northeast or the southwest, and that can be quite handy. And with the European beverage, I can do the same. I can fire northwest or southeast, and that's got its advantages. So just depends on the circumstances that you're in. Now, if you don't have, as I say, if you don't have room to put up a 600-foot beverage, don't despair. A beverage half that size will still work. It'll work very well on 80 meters. It's one wavelength. Sorry, it will be one wavelength on 80 meters, and it would be half wavelength on 160. So obviously the results of 160 are not quite as good. 80 meters, it's okay. Still gives you 2 wavelengths on 40 meters, which is more than adequate. And on 40, the results are quite good, because there's a fair bit of, even from Perth in WA, there's a fair bit of noise on 40 meters. So most of our noise comes in from the north. So I'm finding that with a northwest or northeast beverage on 40 meters, that's in my case 4 wavelengths long, I'm getting quite a sharp pattern, and it nulls out most of the noise from the north. However, this has led to some other issues whereby maybe there are times where I really want to use the beverage to work JAs, and they're predominantly a north bearing from Perth. So I've been experimenting for the last couple of years with a beverage on the ground, a bog. And when I first found out about these beverage on grounds, I really didn't think it was going to work. But I thought it's worthwhile having a bit of a play around with this and see if I can get some results with it. So I now have a beverage on ground firing to the north, and it's unterminated, which seems to be the way to go with beverage on the ground. and for 160 metres, the preferred length seemed to be around about 240 feet. So it wasn't as long as a full wavelength on 160 with the traditional Beverage. And that's got something to do with the ground effect. Very hard to model the Beverage on the ground. I've managed to model the other Beverages that are 7 to 8 foot above the ground, but the Beverage on the ground doesn't really seem to model that well. It's really difficult to try and model something that's, maybe you can only really say, well, it's hypothetically, 1 inch above the ground. It doesn't seem to model that well. Anyway, the results on 160, 80 and 40 with the Beverage on the ground to the north are very good. There are times with the JAs where the JAs are stronger on that Beverage than they are on either the northwest or the northeast one. That's because it's on 40, they've both got, all those antennas have got fairly sharp pattern due to their length. So I'm seriously considering putting some more Beverage on grounds down, not up, around the block and see what sort of results we can get. I've got a switching system here in the shack, so I can switch between the Beverage on ground and the other Beverages and the main antennas, and made some audio recordings of this, and it's quite interesting that the difference is quite remarkable, and it really turns stations into stations you can work, whereas stations you can barely hear. It's quite good. So in the recent OSGB Baru Commonwealth contest, a good friend of mine, Steve VK6VZ, who lives about 3 or 4 miles from me, just over the other side of the hill, and he's got pretty good setup. He's got an IC7610 as well. He's got some good antennas. He's got an 80 metre dipole up at around about 90 feet, and he's got a 40 metre rotatable dipole, HF beam. So it's not a bad setup, all on the one tower. And he reported that certainly on 80 and 40, I was working stations that he couldn't hear. Now, that's only because I'm listening on a Beverage. It's not because his antenna's not working. He's got pretty good signal on the low bands. And he's a top band enthusiast. And I've been talking to him quite seriously about the idea of him getting a Beverage antenna as his QDH. He hasn't got quite as much space as I've got, so there's a few logistical problems, but certainly the bog, the Beverage on the ground, is something you can do. It's almost a bit of a stealth antenna. You don't have to terminate it. As long as you can get it out there in the preferred direction, it will give you some good results. And certainly the one I've got, around about 240 feet, 70 metres long. It's not terminated, as I say, and it's fed at the feed point with a 9-to-1 transformer. So with these transformers, I've used a variety of transformer types. The binocular transformers, type sort of 43 ferrite material, they're quite popular, work quite well. You've got to use fairly thin wire to get the turns on there. And I believe for the 9-to-1 transformer, I just used a traditional toroid, probably type 43 or type 61 material, and had a 9-to-1 transformer with the primary and the secondary, and that feeds the Beverage on ground, and that seems to work quite well. Again, fed with some 75 ohm TV coax, that seems to work quite well for these receive antennas. And certainly the feed points are not that close to the shack. Essentially, the way the block is orientated in relation to the shack, the feed points for all these antennas are probably at least 30 to 40 metres away from where the shack is. So there's a reasonable run of coax on the way out to the receive antenna. So I certainly can recommend these antennas as a way to get a better receive performance. You won't obviously notice so much difference if you try to use them on the HF bands on 2015 and 10. There are some advantages to using a receive antenna on those bands, and I'll come to that in a moment. But I'm primarily talking about the low bands here. I'm a bit of a CW enthusiast, so a lot of the CW type work that I do, if I'm working guys and it's they're down in the noise, I wouldn't be able to work them by using either my beam or my high dipole on 40 or the dipole I've got on 80 metres up at about 90 feet. It's too hard with the noise and the static. And plus, we've just come through our summer season here, so there's been a fair number of storms around the coast of Australia over the last 3 to 4 months, and that makes a difference. Obviously, it's not the answer to every circumstance. There are times where no matter what you do, you're not going to pull these weak signals in. But it's pretty amazing what you can do with just a piece of wire, a transformer, maybe a terminating resistor, and a switch box. It makes a huge difference. I've also got another receive antenna further down the block of land, a little bit further away from the shack, and that's just a low dipole. It's a low dipole fed with some open wire line through a 4-to-1 balun, just for receive, and the feed point's only at about 25 feet. It's away from the main transmit antennas, and actually on occasions it works quite well. It works quite well on 40 and also on 20 meters when the band is noisy and perhaps the beam's just picking up too much noise. So on 20 meters, the transmit antenna is a 3-element beam at around about 75 feet. And sometimes there's just a lot of noise coming in, so quite often I might flick over to the low dipole just to receive. Now, if I was trying to use that low dipole and transmit, it's really not that good. It really doesn't work that well. It's going to be several S points down on my main beam that's way up in the air and has 3 elements. But on receive, there's some advantages to it. So it's certainly something to consider. There are various derivations of the Beverage and the Beverage on ground. Certainly you can put up a low loop. You can have a low loop close to the ground. You can have triangular loops that are terminated loops, grounded loops, and you can switch between those. There's quite a lot of information out there about various types of receive antennas. Obviously commercial versions available as well. There's things like the K9AY type loop antennas. There's a lot out there that's dedicated towards receive antenna. But what I would say is with the Beverage antenna, it's very forgiving. You can put it up, and I don't think I've ever had a Beverage antenna that I've put up that really hasn't worked. And mine are certainly not in straight lines. They tend to dogleg a bit across the block. They're just simply supported on tree trunks. Lots of trees up here in the bush on the block of land, and it's pretty easy to find the nearest tree and tie off an insulator and just run the wire through. If the wire breaks, well, it's only thin wire. It's really not a huge problem. We do get quite a lot of kangaroos up here. They come bounding across the block. I've kind of got the wire just about high enough that the kangaroos don't get involved. But every now and again, we can get a wire breakage. It may not be a kangaroo. It could be just wear and tear. It could be the wind, the trees swaying, that sort of thing. And just simply patch a new bit of wire in and away we go. I've had these Beverages up now for probably 7 or 8 years, and there's no way I would really contemplate doing any serious low band DXing without them, or for that matter, any serious low band contesting without the Beverages. It's just wouldn't be something that I'd be too keen on doing. So, as I say, it's certainly worth having a look at these. Put one up to start with. Maybe if you can't get one up in the air, put a Beverage on ground down in a preferred direction. Although the Beverage on ground I've got is 240 feet long, and I haven't tried this, but theoretically you could put something there for maybe 120 foot long. It's going to work quite well on 80 and 40. And I realise that not everybody's got the extra space to do something for 160. So be interested to any of you try this antenna or try these antennas. Be interested to get your comments. The HF bands continue to be fairly flat from here. Certainly nothing on 10 meters at all. 15 meters opens sporadically. 20 meters not been too bad heading into the early evening, but closes quite early, either to the US or to Europe. And 40 meters has been good. 40 meters has been probably the standout, working quite a few Europeans quite a while before there, several hours before their their sunset, and also working into the US quite a few hours after their sunrise. So 40 metres has been the go-to band from here. As we head into the Northern Hemisphere summer, there'll be more noise at that end, so it makes it a little bit harder from Perth to sometimes make these QSOs on the low bands with the additional QRN that's been experienced in the Northern Hemisphere. I've not done a great deal on 80 metres over the last couple of weeks, but prior to that 80 was fairly good, and worked into certainly into Eastern Europe on 80 metres late in our evening here in Perth with some good signal strengths. But again, the QRN in Europe will start to have an impact on these QSOs on the low bands, certainly trying to work out of Perth. So I noticed the sunspot numbers were slightly up over the last week or two, and the flux was in the low 70s. So although we probably are at the bottom of the cycle, I'm sure things will start to improve soon and get an uplift in the HF bands, which would be really good. And we're heading obviously into our autumn time now. Some cooler weather in Perth, which is really good. Time to get on with some more antenna projects. The weather's cooled off a little bit. I've got a few trees we've got to take out and trim back. Problem with the trees, it's they're very nice, but they do grow. So it's starting to cause a few problems with cranking down the tower and cranking over the tower. Various tree branches that have grown and got in the way. So a little bit of tree work coming up to try and clear some space and get some make it a little bit easier to work on the antennas. So that about wraps up this episode. You can leave a review on Apple Podcast or your app of choice. If you've got any questions about antennas or HF operating or contesting or CW, feel free to email us on hamradiotopics@gmail.com. And in the next episode, might have a chat about simple beam switching systems, simple wire beam switching systems using relays and certain lengths of coax to create the beam system on a wire antenna with a driven element and a parasitic element. And these can be quite effective, easily can give you two directions with the flick of a switch, and certainly on the LF bands this can be quite useful. I've got a switchable wire beam on 40 metres, works very well indeed, and it's quite good to be able to just change direction with the flick of a switch, and there's a pretty good front to back ratio on these antennas. Quite simple to build, quite a simple matching box. We can describe this in the next episode. So until next time, 73s for now from Kevin, VK6 Lima Whiskey.